Do you believe in fate? Imagine that years ago your life was hanging by a thread, that at the most fragile moment of your existence, an unknown person came out of nowhere and gave you a second chance. Now imagine that time has passed. You've moved on, built an empire, conquered the world, but deep down something has always been missing. And then, one day, out of the blue, a lost memory awakens inside you. The memory of a touch, of a voice, a name. And suddenly, the only thing that matters is finding that person. What happens when a man who has everything discovers that his biggest debt can't be paid with money? What if that debt is actually the start of something he never imagined? This isn't just a story about reunions. It's about crossed destinies, about silent promises, and about a love that waited years to happen. But time may have been generous, or it may have taken its toll. Now the only question that remains is there still time to change everything? Daniel stared out of his penthouse window at the illuminated city, but his mind was far away. The glow of the skyscrapers couldn't fill the emptiness that consumed him. He raised his glass of whiskey, swirling the amber liquid slowly. Life had taken him to a level of success that few achieved, but there was something about him that didn't feel complete. He leaned back on the sofa, massaging his temples. Sleepless nights had become commonplace, but that night a specific memory plagued him. A memory buried under years of appointments, meetings, and business. A chill on his skin, the smell of wet asphalt, the blood dripping through his fingers. He blinked a few times, feeling a shiver run down his spine. It was the memory of the day he almost died. More than that, it was the memory of the woman who had saved him. Daniel frowned, trying to pull out the details of the scene. Everything was blurred. He remembered the panic, the pain in his chest, the metallic taste of blood in his mouth, but what stuck out most was the voice. Soft, but full of despair. "You'll be all right. Stay with me." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. It was the first time in years that his subconscious had brought up that memory so clearly. Who was she? How had he never thought about it before? He remembered the feel of her hand holding his, the warmth of her fingers, which contrasted with the coldness of his skin at that moment. "Who were you?" he muttered to himself. He swallowed, his heart racing. How could he have simply gone on with his life without ever seeking to know who had given him a second chance? The woman who, for a brief moment, had become his anchor between life and death. He got up and put his glass on the coffee table. He had to find out. The clock was almost 3 in the morning when he opened his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he started typing. He scoured old files, news articles, and hospital records. He was looking for anything that mentioned the accident. Information was scarce. Only vague reports about a man found seriously injured after a robbery. Then, among the medical reports, he found a detail that caught his eye. A name, Sophia. Daniel took a deep breath, reading that word over and over again. Sophia. The name reverberated inside him like a familiar musical note. What did it mean? Was it her name? He searched for more information in the report, but there wasn't much. Just a brief report that a woman had called for rescue and stayed by his side until the ambulance arrived. No surname, no contact details. He leaned back in his chair, feeling his heartbeat accelerate. So you exist. The insomnia was replaced by a growing restlessness. He needed to know who Sophia was, to know how her life went on after that night. But above all, he needed to see her again. Sophia's name remained in Daniel's mind like a repetitive melody, a riddle he needed to solve. The next morning, sitting in his office, he stared at the computer screen without really seeing the emails that flashed before his eyes. The medical report contained little information, no surname, no address, just the mention that a woman called Sophia had been present at the rescue. He pressed his fingers against his temples in frustration. It couldn't be that difficult. Eduardo. His voice cut through the silence. His assistant entered the office almost immediately. "Yes, sir? I want you to find a woman called Sophia. She was present at my accident years ago. I need to know where she is." The assistant frowned. "The accident?" He hesitated. "It was a long time ago, sir. That could be complicated." Daniel leaned forward, facing him firmly. "I don't want to know if it's complicated. I want to know if it's possible." The man nodded and left the room, pulling out his phone. Daniel took a deep breath. Was he really doing this? Investing time and resources to find a woman who might not even remember him? But he remembered her, and that was enough. 2 days passed without any concrete response. On the third, Eduardo entered his office with a serious look on his face. "We've found something." Daniel looked up immediately. "Tell me." It wasn't easy. The only concrete clue was the medical report, but one of the paramedics on duty that night remembered it. He said that Sophia insisted on accompanying him to the hospital, but disappeared before leaving any contact information. Daniel frowned. "And what else?" Eduardo hesitated for a moment before continuing. "She works in a small cafe in a remote area. She lives a simple life. She seems to have no idea who you've become." The information caught him off guard. He leaned back in his chair, absorbing it. "A cafe?" "Yes, sir." Daniel was silent for a long moment, staring out of the window at the landscape. The idea that Sophia was living a life completely removed from his own was intriguing. He had become one of the most influential businessmen in the country. She, on the other hand, seemed to have followed a discreet path, without any trace of the impact she had made on his life. It was time to change that. "I want to see her." Eduardo nodded, not at all surprised. "I can arrange a discreet meeting if you prefer." Daniel smiled. "No, I want to go there." In the late afternoon, Daniel parked his car in a busy street, very different from the places he used to go. The cafe was modest, with a few outdoor tables and a display case full of simple breads and pastries. A familiar smell of fresh coffee hung in the air, and for a moment he felt something he hadn't felt for years: nervousness. He took a deep breath and went inside. The bell on the door jingled, but no one paid it much attention. He scanned the room with his eyes until he found her. Sophia. She was wearing an apron over her simple clothes, concentrating on clearing a table. Her hair was tied up in a messy bun, and there was a trace of tiredness in her expression. Daniel felt a tightness in his chest. He approached her slowly, until she noticed him. "Good afternoon." His voice sounded more hesitant than he would have liked. She looked up and frowned. "Good afternoon," she replied, studying him curiously. The silence lengthened, and he realized that she didn't recognize him. Daniel smiled slightly. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" Sophia blinked, surprised by the question. "Should I?" He felt a mixture of frustration and fascination. "Maybe I do, but I don't blame you. It's been many years." Sophia looked at him for a moment longer before shaking her head in confusion. "I'm sorry, but I'm in the middle of work. Do you need anything?" Daniel hesitated, but then let out a sentence that would change everything. "You saved my life." The impact of his words was evident in her expression. Her eyes widened and her posture stiffened. "What?" "Years ago, on a rainy night, you found me on the brink of death. You called for help. You stayed by my side." Sophia opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. Daniel stepped forward. "I needed to find you." Sophia stood still, as if time around her had stopped. Daniel's words hung between them, loaded with a truth she hadn't expected to hear. What?" Her voice came out hesitant, almost inaudible. Daniel observed the confusion on her face. He didn't blame her. It wasn't every day that someone came out of nowhere saying that their life had been saved by you. "Years ago I was on the brink of death," he repeated, remaining calm. "You found me, called for help, and held my hand until the ambulance arrived." Sophia blinked a few times, processing that. "That was—" She stopped, trying to pull the memory back. Her eyes locked on his for a moment, and then something changed in her expression. "The robbery," Daniel nodded. "Yes." The silence between them was broken by a customer calling out to Sophia at the counter. "Wait a minute," she said, still stunned. She walked over to the till to answer the woman, but her movements were automatic, distant. Daniel watched her, giving her time to absorb everything. When she returned, she crossed her arms and looked at him with a mixture of incredulity and skepticism. "That's why you came here? After all this time? I needed to find you. But why?" The question hung in the air. Why did he need to? To thank her? To offer something in return? Or was there another reason, one he still couldn't explain even to himself? "I owed you my life." He chose his words carefully. "And I never knew who you were." That didn't seem right. Sophia took a deep breath and pulled up a chair. "I remember that night," she admitted, sitting down, "but I thought you hadn't survived." Daniel felt a chill run down his spine when he heard that. "I almost didn't make it." She nodded thoughtfully. "I stayed there until the paramedics took you away. Then I never heard anything more." Daniel stared at her for a long moment. "And you never wanted to know?" Sophia laughed, but without humor. "You were a stranger. I didn't know who you were, or if your family would show up at the hospital, and frankly, I had my own life to get on with." He noticed the slight stiffness in her posture, as if she were protecting herself. "I understand," she said simply. She crossed her arms, studying him. "But that doesn't answer my question. Why now? Why after years do you want to meet me?" Daniel gave her a small smile. "Because I haven't forgotten." Sophia looked away, seeming uncomfortable with the intensity of that moment. "Right. Well, I'm glad you're all right." She seemed to want to end the conversation there, but Daniel wasn't ready for that. "Do you have a minute to talk?" She hesitated. "My shift ends in half an hour. I'll wait." Sophia snorted, but didn't argue. Exactly 30 minutes later, she took off her apron and picked up her bag. "Let's go." They left the cafe and walked a few blocks in silence. "So," she finally said, "now that you've found me, what do you want from me?" The question took Daniel by surprise. "What do I want?" "Yes." He thanked her. "You've had your emotional closure, I don't know. Now, can you get on with your millionaire life?" He noticed the slight acidity in her voice. "You have no idea who I am, do you?" Sophia stopped and stared at him. "You look rich. That's saying a lot." He let out a nasal laugh. "Yes, I am rich. But I wasn't when we met." She raised an eyebrow. "That's interesting. Since that night, my life has changed completely. I've built an empire, but something was always left behind, something incomplete. And that lack was me." Daniel hesitated for a moment before answering. "Maybe." Sophia hadn't expected that answer. "Look, I don't know what you expect, but my life has nothing to do with yours." "Who says it has to?" She remained silent. Daniel observed the internal struggle in her eyes. "I just want to get to know you." Sophia bit her lip, pondering. "I'm not who you think I am," he smiled. "Find out if I'm wrong." She let out an exasperated sigh. "A coffee." Daniel winked. "What? We can have a coffee and talk, but without all this stuff about fate or second chances. Just a coffee." His smile widened, closed. The cafe where they met the next day was different from the one where Sophia worked. Small, discreet, cozy. Daniel had chosen the place on purpose, without the luxury and formality of the restaurants he usually frequented. He wanted Sophia to feel comfortable. She arrived on time, wearing a simple blouse and jeans, making no effort to impress him. He liked that. "So, where do we start?" she asked, as soon as she sat down. Daniel watched her for a moment before answering. "Tell me about yourself," she snorted, picking up the menu. "What do you want to know?" "Everything." She looked up, suspicious. "Don't you have a more specific way of asking? What do you do when you're not serving coffee to strangers?" Sophia hesitated for a moment before shrugging. "I live, I work, I pay bills. Nothing glamorous." Daniel didn't expect her to open up so quickly, so he changed his approach. "Have you always worked in the cafe?" "No, I've done everything. Supermarket cashier, receptionist, clerk. The cafe was just where I ended up staying the longest." "Any particular reason?" Sophia smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "The rent has to be paid every month." Daniel realized the harshness behind her answer. She wasn't willing to romanticize her life. "And you?" she asked, crossing her arms. He raised an eyebrow. "What about me? You're a mysterious millionaire who turns up out of the blue to meet a stranger from his past. It's a bit suspicious." Daniel laughed quietly. "I'm not that mysterious." "That's exactly what a mysterious man would say." He smiled. "I've worked hard to get where I am. I went from trainee to entrepreneur. I grew up in business and built my own company. And now you have so much money that you don't know what to do with it." "Exactly." Sophia shook her head. "I'll never understand this world." He tilted his head. "Why is that?" "Because people like you never understand people like me." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean? You want to know my life? Then I'll tell you." She leaned back in her chair. "Do you know what it's like to wake up early and work all day, come home exhausted, and still have to worry about whether the money will last until the end of the month?" Daniel remained silent. "I bet you've never had to choose between paying a bill and buying food." He continued to listen without interrupting her. "You live in a world where people worry about investments, while I count coins before catching the bus. So tell me, what exactly do you want with me?" Daniel absorbed her every word. "I just want to understand you." She laughed. "Nobody wants to understand. They want to observe, feel good about hearing a different story, then go back to their lives." Daniel leaned forward. "Do you really believe that?" "I don't have to. That's how it's always been." The waiter arrived with the coffees and interrupted the moment. Sophia picked up her cup and took a sip before facing him. "So are you going to keep trying to understand me, or have you had your dose of reality for today?" Daniel smiled. "I'm still not satisfied." She let out a sigh. "You're stubborn. And you like it." Sophia rolled her eyes, but he could see the amused twinkle in them. When they left the cafe, the day was getting cooler. They walked leisurely until Sophia broke the silence. "I don't think you have room for someone like me in your life." Daniel stopped walking. "And who says I need space?" She shook her head. "That doesn't make sense." "It does for me." Sophia sighed, crossing her arms. "This isn't a movie, Daniel. There's no happy ending between two such different worlds." He stared at her for a long moment before replying. "Maybe there is no ending. Maybe this is just a beginning." Sophia held her breath, feeling the impact of the words. Daniel smiled softly. "I'm going to prove you wrong." And for some reason, Sophia didn't doubt it. The following days brought unexpected encounters. Daniel and Sophia began to meet more often, whether it was for a quick coffee before work or for casual conversations that went on longer than planned. At first, Sophia tried to keep her distance, but Daniel's presence was enveloping, almost unavoidable. There was something about the way he listened to her, the way he looked at her without judgment, that made her forget the stark differences between them. "Have you noticed that you always find an excuse to see me?" Sophia commented when he appeared in the cafe once again. Daniel smiled, leaning his elbows on the counter. "I just like the coffee here." She crossed her arms. "You have a $1,000 espresso machine in your apartment, but I don't have you serving the coffee." She rolled her eyes, but a smile formed before she could stop it. Time passed and something changed. The encounters stopped being casual. They became natural. Sophia began to wait for him, even without admitting it. Daniel, for his part, didn't make a point of hiding it. "If one day you say you miss me, I promise I won't tell anyone," he teased as they walked down an empty street. Sophia laughed. "I wouldn't miss you, even if you disappeared into space. Then I'll have to try harder." She looked at him, trying to decipher the seriousness in his tone. "Why?" Daniel stopped and stared at her. "Because I like you." Sophia blinked, surprised by his blunt honesty. "You like a concept, something you can't have." "I like you," he repeated without hesitation. She looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity. "That's a problem, Daniel." "For whom?" "For me." He took a step forward, reducing the distance between them. "Then tell me to leave." Sophia opened her mouth but couldn't say anything. "That's what I thought." She sighed, without the strength to argue. That night, Sophia lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Why did he move her so much? There was something about Daniel that made her let her guard down, something that made her vulnerable, but it was dangerous, because if there was one thing she knew about life, it was that people like him and people like her didn't end up together. The next day, Sophia tried to act normally. However, something was different, Daniel noticed. You're trying to distance yourself. I'm trying to be rational. He shook his head. What are you afraid will happen? She didn't answer right away. That I'll get lost in your world and forget who I am. He held her hand, and for the first time she didn't flinch. Then I promise that if that happens, I'll bring you back. Sophia stared at him. Something inside her told her that he was telling the truth. But at the same time, something inside her also said that it wouldn't be that simple. The illusion that they could keep that relationship isolated from the rest of the world was short-lived. One evening, while Sophia was closing up the cafe, a familiar voice interrupted her moment of tranquility. "So you're dating millionaires now?" She turned around slowly. The man standing in front of her was someone she hadn't seen for years, but knew all too well. "What are you doing here?" he asked, crossing his arms. "I saw you the other day, going out with him, with the man in the expensive suit. I didn't think he was your type." Sophia snorted. "You never knew anything about me." He smiled, but the look in his eyes carried something that bothered her. "You know he's not for you, don't you? He can use you, play with the novelty, but in the end, he always goes back to his world." She felt a twinge in her chest, but didn't show it. "I appreciate your concern, but I don't need it." The man laughed, shaking his head. "I'm just saying the obvious, and I'm telling you to get on with your life." She went into the cafe and locked the door before he could reply. But the words stayed in her mind, echoing more than they should have. When he met Daniel that night, he was more distant than usual. He realized. "What happened?" Sophia hesitated. "Someone from my past showed up. He said some things that made me think." "What kind of things?" She sighed. "That people like us don't end up together." Daniel studied her for a moment before answering. "And you believe that?" She didn't know what to say. Daniel took a deep breath. "I'm not that guy, Sophia. I'm not here on a whim. But what if he's right? What if this is just a mistake waiting to happen?" He held her face gently. "Then let it be the most beautiful mistake of my life." Sophia closed her eyes, feeling the truth in his words. But sometimes truth wasn't enough. Over the next few days, doubt grew inside her. Daniel sensed it. He tried to prove in small gestures that he was there for her. But Sophia knew that there was a difference between wanting something and being able to support it. And then the moment came when she had to choose. "Tell me this is a bad idea," Sophia said, staring at Daniel. They stood in front of his car, the world seeming smaller around them. "I can't do this," she sighed, crossing her arms. "I don't know if I can handle this life, Daniel, with all of this." He looked her in the eye, unafraid of what he would find there. "You can." She hesitated. "But do I want to?" Daniel felt the blow. "Sophia." She shook her head, looking away. "I just need some time." He took a deep breath, trying to hold in his frustration. "Then tell me when your time is up." Sophia didn't answer. She just walked away. And Daniel felt for the first time that perhaps he was about to lose her. The days without Sophia seemed longer. Daniel wasn't used to waiting. In his life, he had always been in control, always known how to act to get what he wanted. But Sophia was different. She wasn't a contract to be signed or a negotiation to be won. She was a choice, and for the first time he didn't know if he would be chosen. Sophia also felt his absence. She spent her days busy in the cafe, trying to ignore the weight growing inside her, trying to convince herself that she had made the right choice by moving away. But at night, when she laid her head on the pillow, Daniel's face would come back. The sound of his laughter, the way he looked at her as if nothing else mattered but her. And that scared her, because maybe nothing else really mattered. The following evening, Daniel picked up the phone, staring at Sophia's contact details. Calling her would be easy, but he knew that wasn't how it should be. She had to come to him, so he waited. But fate always has its own plans. Sophia was leaving the cafe when she noticed something strange. The normally busy street was empty. She felt a shiver run up her spine. She tightened her grip, but a voice stopped her. "You should have heard me." Her heart raced. The man from her past was there again, but this time there was something different about him, something dangerous. "What do you want?" His voice came out firmer than she had expected. He took a step forward, smiling. "Do you think you can just throw your life away to chase an impossible dream?" She took a step back. "This has nothing to do with you." "Yes, it does, because you need to understand that you don't belong in his world." She tried to pull away, but he grabbed her arm. "Let me go," he squeezed. "Maybe I need to teach you a lesson." And then everything happened too fast. Daniel didn't know what had brought him there. Perhaps an instinct, a feeling. Perhaps fate was giving him one last chance. He turned the corner at just the right moment. He saw Sophia. He saw her expression. And he saw the man holding her arm. Anger came like a punch to the gut. He moved forward without thinking. Let her go. The man hesitated, but not long enough. Daniel pushed him hard, making him stagger backwards. "Who the hell are you?" the other growled. Daniel didn't answer. He just stood between him and Sophia. She looked at him with a mixture of surprise and relief. The man hesitated for a moment, then laughed. "Do you really think you can protect her?" Daniel didn't need to answer. The look in his eyes said it all. The other man noticed and finally stepped back. Sophia was still shaking when Daniel took her hand. "Are you all right?" She nodded slowly. Yes, she was. But she wasn't. And he knew it. They walked in silence until they reached Daniel's penthouse. Sophia was sitting on the sofa, still trying to process everything. He watched her for a moment before sitting down next to her. "You need to tell me the truth now," he said. "Do you want to run away from this?" Sophia sighed, closing her eyes for a moment. "I was afraid, Daniel, not just of what happened today, but of you, of us." He held her hand gently. Fear never stopped anything from being worthwhile. She opened her eyes, meeting his, and at that moment, she knew he was right. Sophia had never been one to make impulsive decisions. Her life had always been guided by the need for security, by the certainty that every choice should lead her down a predictable path. But there, sitting next to Daniel, she realized that perhaps predictability had never been what she really needed. He didn't pressure her. He didn't insist. He just waited. "I can't promise it will be easy," she said at last. "I've never asked for easy," Daniel replied without hesitation. Sophia let out a sigh, looking down at their entwined hands. "So what happens now? Now, you let me prove to you that this can work." She raised her eyes, meeting his. "And if it doesn't?" Daniel smiled. "Then I'll make a mistake with you." Sophia felt something inside her crumble, like a barrier she had been trying to keep intact. Perhaps it was there, at that moment, that everything changed. Perhaps it had already changed a long time ago. The days that followed were different. Not because anything great had happened, but because Sophia had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. She still worked in the cafe. She still came home tired. But now, there was Daniel. There were conversations on the phone before bed, impromptu dinners, meetings that didn't need to be arranged because being close to each other had become natural. And for the first time in a long time, Sophia felt like she belonged somewhere. "Have you thought about what comes after this?" Sophia asked one evening as they walked hand in hand. Daniel looked at her sideways, smiling. "After what?" "After now." He stopped, gently pulling her closer. "What comes after is whatever we want it to be." Sophia laughed. Always so sure of himself. "No." Daniel ran his fingers down her cheek. "All I know is that, after spending so long looking for something, I didn't know what it was. I finally found it." She bit her lip, feeling her heart race. "And what was it?" He looked at her as if the answer was obvious. You. Sophia held her breath, and in that instant, she knew there were no more doubts. So when Daniel leaned in to kiss her, she simply closed her eyes and let it happen. Because, for the first time, there was no more fear, just them, and the beginning of everything.